The volcanic soil beneath your feet tells stories older than human memory, dark and rich with minerals that once flowed as molten rock from the Earth's core. Walking through the forests of Hawaii's Big Island feels like stepping into the planet's autobiography, where every tree, every fern, every breath of humid air carries the weight of creation itself. The native Ohia Lehua trees rise from ground that might have been barren lava only decades ago, their twisted roots gripping the porous rock with determined tenacity. These crimson-flowered trees hold sacred significance in Hawaiian culture, believed to embody the warrior Ohia and his beloved Lehua, transformed by the volcano goddess Pele in a moment of jealous rage. According to legend, picking the Lehua blossoms brings rain as the lovers weep at their separation. And the forests here exist in constant conversation with fire. Kaiklauea, one of the world's most active volcanoes, has been reshaping this landscape for hundreds of thousands of years, and its most recent major eruption in 2018 reminded everyone that this conversation never truly ends. Lava flows consumed homes, roads, and memories, adding roughly 875 acres of new land to the island's southeastern coast. The destruction felt catastrophic to those who lost everything, yet it represented merely another sentence in the Earth's ongoing narrative. Within months, the first pioneer plants began appearing on the cooled lava, ferns unfurling their delicate fronds in the cracks, seeds carried by wind and birds finding purchase in impossible places. Walking through these regenerating zones reveals nature's remarkable resilience. The Hawaiian word aloha contains within it the concept of alo, meaning presence and sharing, and ha, the breath of life. The land itself seems to breathe here, exhaling warm, sulfurous air from volcanic vents, inhaling the moisture-laden trade winds that sweep across thousands of miles of open Pacific. The forests grow in layers, from the coastal lowlands where coconut palms sway toward the sea, up through the dense tropical rainforests where rainfall can exceed 200 inches annually, to the sparse, otherworldly vegetation near the volcanic summits where the air grows thin and the ground radiates heat. Native Hawaiians developed sophisticated systems for understanding and living within these volcanic landscapes. The Ahupua'a land division system organized communities from mountain to sea, recognizing that water flowing from the peaks nourished everything below. Taro fields terraced into the valleys, fish ponds constructed along the coasts, and forests carefully managed for specific resources, everything connected in a web of practical wisdom accumulated over centuries. The volcanic soil, once broken down and enriched, becomes extraordinarily fertile, capable of supporting diverse agricultural systems that fed substantial populations long before Western contact. The cultural landscape layers itself atop the geological one. Ancient petroglyphs carved into coastal lava fields depict human figures, turtles, and mysterious symbols whose meanings remain partially obscured by time. These images, created by removing the dark, oxidized surface of the rock to reveal the lighter stone beneath, demark places of significance, boundaries, trails, birthing sites, and fishing grounds. Modern visitors often walk past them unknowingly, focused on the dramatic coastlines and active lava flows, missing these quieter testimonies to human presence and adaptation. The Big Island's varied microclimates create ecological zones so distinct that you can experience multiple worlds in a single day's drive. The windward side, facing the prevailing trade winds, drowns in rainfall, its forests draped with moss and ferns, streams rushing toward the sea. The leeward side, sheltered by the massive peaks of Mauna Kea and Mauna Loa, receives far less precipitation, creating drier forests and grasslands. Near the summits, where elevation exceeds 13,000 feet, conditions become alpine, even hosting seasonal snow. Mauna Kea's peak, being considered the most sacred place in Hawaiian cosmology, serves as both a spiritual center and, controversially, the site of astronomical observatories that take advantage of the clear, stable air above most of the atmosphere. This tension between preservation and progress, between indigenous rights and scientific advancement, reflects broader struggles playing out across American landscapes. The protests over telescope construction on Mauna Kea brought international attention to questions about who decides how sacred lands should be used, whose knowledge systems take precedence, and how societies balance competing values. The mountain itself remains indifferent to human disputes, its snow-capped peak visible from across the island when clouds permit, a sentinel watching over the volcanic activity still shaping the land below. Flying northeast across thousands of miles of continent, the landscape transforms so completely that Hawaii's lush greenery and flowing lava seem almost imaginary. The Great Plains stretch in waves of grass and agricultural fields, broken by rivers that carved their paths over millions of years. Then, in western South Dakota, the earth fractures into something unexpected and strange. The Badlands rise from the prairie like a fever dream, their layered spires and deep gullies painted in bands of rust, cream, and gray. This eroded wonderland covers nearly 244,000 acres of protected land, though the formations extend beyond park boundaries into areas still grazed by cattle and buffalo. The name Badlands came from early French-Canadian trappers who called them les mauvaises terres à traverser, bad lands to travel through. The Lakota people knew them as Makosika, which translates similarly to land bad. The terrain earned its reputation honestly. Sharp ridges, unstable slopes, and a near-complete absence of water make crossing this country challenging even today. Summer temperatures can soar past 110 degrees Fahrenheit, baking the clay formations into crumbling hardness, while winter brings bitter cold and howling winds that scream through the canyons and buttes. Prairie rattlesnakes, the only venomous snake species in the park, coil in the shade of rocks and bushes, adding another hazard to navigation. Yet the Badlands possess haunting beauty. Sunrise and sunset transform the formations, the low-angle light emphasizing every ridge and shadow, setting the iron-rich layers ablaze with color. The striations in the rock faces tell geological stories with unusual clarity. The oldest exposed layer, the Pierre Shale, formed from sediments deposited when a vast inland sea covered the region roughly 75 million years ago. Above this lies the Chadron Formation, then the Brule Formation, and finally the Sharps Formation, each layer representing different environments, different climates, different chapters in deep time. These sedimentary layers contain one of the world's richest fossil beds, preserving creatures that roamed North America between 37 and 23 million years ago during the Oligocene epoch. Paleontologists have discovered ancient horses no bigger than house cats, sheep-sized ancestors of modern rhinoceroses, saber-toothed cats, and giant pig-like creatures called entelodonts. And the Badlands became a treasure trove for fossil hunters, and the discoveries made here fundamentally shaped scientific understanding of mammalian evolution. The rock preserves not just bones, but also occasional impressions of leaves, insects, and other organic materials, snapshots of ecosystems long vanished. The formations themselves result from two competing geological processes, deposition and erosion. Ancient rivers carried sediments east from the rising Rocky Mountains, depositing layer upon layer across the plains. Then, around 500,000 years ago, the Cheyenne and White Rivers began cutting down through these deposits, carving the dramatic landscape visible today. The erosion continues at a measurable rate, roughly 1 inch per year in many areas, meaning the Badlands constantly change their configuration. Features prominent today will erode away entirely within another 500,000 years, while new formations emerge from currently buried layers. Water, despite its scarcity, remains the primary sculptor. Rain rarely falls gently here. Instead, violent thunderstorms drop intense precipitation onto hard ground that can't absorb moisture quickly. Water sheets across the clay surfaces, cutting tiny rills that merge into gullies, then into ravines, carrying away loose sediment and leaving behind the more resistant formations. This process creates the distinctive castellated appearance, walls and towers rising from debris slopes, looking for all the world like ruined castles built by giants. Human history in the Badlands extends back thousands of years, though the harsh environment never supported large permanent populations. Various Native American groups used the region for hunting, traveling through carefully known routes where water could be found. The Lakota people developed deep spiritual connections to specific sites within the Badlands, places where young men went on vision quests, seeking guidance through fasting and prayer in the solitude of the formations. These spiritual practices continued even after American expansion pushed indigenous peoples onto reservations and opened the plains to ranching and homesteading. The Badlands hold darker memories, too. The Wounded Knee Massacre occurred just south of the current park boundaries in December 1890, when U.S. Army troops killed hundreds of Lakota men, women, and children, effectively ending the Indian Wars of the Great Plains. This tragedy cast a long shadow over the region, and the Badlands themselves became part of the landscape of loss and displacement experienced by indigenous peoples. In 1976, the National Park Service returned a portion of the Badlands to the Oglala Lakota tribe, now managed cooperatively as the Stronghold Unit, one of the few examples of national parkland restoration to tribal stewardship. During World War II, the U.S. Air Force used a portion of the Badlands as a gunnery range, training pilots and bombardiers in the stark, empty landscape that resembled potential battlefields overseas. Unexploded ordnance still occasionally turns up, dangerous reminders of this military history buried among the ancient fossils. After the war, efforts to restore this bombed landscape faced significant challenges. The thin soils and harsh climate meant that vegetation recovered slowly, and some areas still show scars from that period of intensive use. Wildlife has adapted to the Badlands in remarkable ways. Bighorn sheep, reintroduced in the 1960s after being hunted to local extinction, now navigate the steep canyon walls with casual grace, their specialized hooves gripping narrow ledges. Black-footed ferrets, once considered extinct, have been bred in captivity and released back into prairie dog colonies in the Buffalo Gap National Grassland adjacent to the park. These ferrets, North America's most endangered mammal, depend entirely on prairie dogs for food and use their burrows for shelter. The Ferret Recovery Program represents one of conservation's most intensive efforts, requiring ongoing monitoring and supplementation to maintain the fragile population. Bison, the iconic megafauna of the plains, were themselves nearly lost to extinction through systematic hunting in the late 1800s. Reintroduced herds now graze the grasslands around the Badlands formations, their massive forms moving across the landscape much as they did for thousands of years before European contact. Watching them, you can almost imagine the plains as they once were, when bison numbered in the tens of millions, and their migration shaped the grasslands themselves, grazing patterns and wallowing behavior influencing vegetation and soil composition across the continent. The contrast between the prairie and the eroded Badlands creates unique ecological edges. Prairie grasses, western wheatgrass, blue grama, needlegrass carpet the flat lands and gentler slopes, their roots reaching deep to find moisture. And these grasses evolved with grazing pressure from bison and fire from lightning strikes and indigenous burning practices. They grow from the base rather than the tips, meaning they can be cropped repeatedly and survive. The deep root systems, sometimes extending 10 feet down, hold soil in place and create rich, dark topsoil that made the plains appealing for agriculture, though farming in this region has always been marginal, subject to cycles of drought that can last years. Within the Badlands formations, vegetation struggles to establish itself on the steep, eroding slopes. Opportunistic plants colonize wherever they can. Yucca plants with their sharp, pointed leaves and tall flower stalks, patches of prickly pear cactus spreading across the flatter areas, scattered shrubs clinging to slopes. The most exposed formations remain nearly bare, their colorful layers displayed without the softening effect of vegetation, geological anatomy laid open for examination. The night sky over the Badlands offers its own spectacle. With minimal light pollution and clear, dry air, stars multiply across the darkness until the Milky Way becomes a river of light overhead. The silence feels profound, broken only by the occasional call of a coyote or the rustle of wind through grass. Standing in that darkness, surrounded by the strange formations barely visible as darker shapes against the star-filled sky, the sense of time deepens. The same stars shone down on the ancient creatures whose fossils now erode from the canyon walls, on the indigenous peoples who crossed these lands following seasonal patterns, on the early explorers and trappers who gave the place its ominous name. Continuing west, the landscape transforms again. The Rockies rise and fall, their peaks holding snow even in summer, forests of pine and aspen clothing their slopes. Rivers rush through narrow canyons, cutting through uplifted rock that tells of continental collisions and mountain-building episodes. Then, crossing into the Great Basin, the terrain becomes something altogether different, a land of internal drainage where water flows toward its own dead ends rather than reaching the sea. The basin holds secrets written in salt and silence. The Bonneville Salt Flats stretch across northwestern Utah like a vision of another planet. During certain times of year, a thin layer of water covers the flats, creating a perfect mirror that reflects sky and clouds so seamlessly that walking across them feels like moving through space itself, untethered from gravity and ordinary reference points. When the water evaporates under the intense summer sun, it leaves behind a crust of salt crystals so pure and white they hurt your eyes, the brightness magnified by the intense sunlight at 4,200 feet elevation. These flats represent the remnant of ancient Lake Bonneville, which covered much of northwestern Utah during the last ice age. At its maximum extent, roughly 18,000 years ago, the lake spread across nearly 20,000 square miles and reached depths of 1,000 feet. As the climate warmed and dried, the lake began shrinking, leaving behind terraces that still mark old shorelines on the surrounding mountains. So the Great Salt Lake represents the largest remaining portion of this ancient water body, though it's only a fraction of Bonneville's former size. The salt flats formed in the lowest areas, where mineral-rich water pooled and evaporated repeatedly, concentrating salts until they precipitated out in thick deposits. The salt crust averages several feet thick across the 30,000-acre expanse of the main flats, underlain by deep layers of salt-saturated mud. During wet periods, this mud becomes unstable, but when dry conditions prevail, the surface hardens into a smooth, flat plain that varies by less than 2 inches across its entire breadth. This extraordinary flatness, combined with the hard surface, made the area perfect for one specific human purpose, going incredibly fast. The history of land speed racing at Bonneville began in 1914, when W.D. Rischel drove a motorcycle across the flats to test their suitability. Word spread among speed enthusiasts, and by the 1930s, the flats became the premier location for land speed record attempts. The names associated with Bonneville read like a who's who of automotive daring. Ab Jenkins, who set multiple endurance and speed records. John Cobb, who pushed past 400 miles per hour in 1947. Art Arfons and Craig Breedlove, who battled back and forth for the record in the 1960s, each pushing the boundaries of engineering and courage. The current land speed record, set in 1997 by Andy Green in the jet-powered Thrust SSC, stands at 763 miles per hour, breaking the sound barrier on land for the first time. Speed Week, held annually since 1949. Draws hundreds of racers and thousands of spectators to the flats. Custom-built vehicles of every description line up for their attempts, streamliners that look more like missiles than cars, vintage hot rods, motorcycles, even diesel trucks. The atmosphere mixes carnival with technical precision, grease-stained teams working through the night to prepare their machines, while campers and trailers create a temporary community in the middle of nowhere. The roar of engines echoes across the empty basin, and the smell of racing fuel hangs in the hot, still air. When a vehicle makes its run, accelerating down the measured course with timing equipment recording every fraction of a second, everyone stops to watch, united in appreciation for the attempt regardless of the outcome. Yet the salt flats face an uncertain future, and the salt crust has been thinning, shrinking by roughly 1/3 over the past 60 years. Mining operations that extract minerals from groundwater beneath the flats have altered the hydrological balance. Climate change affects precipitation patterns and evaporation rates. The very qualities that make Bonneville unique, its specific geological and hydrological conditions, make it fragile. Racing organizations and environmental groups have found common cause in pushing for restoration efforts, recognizing that this landscape serves both ecological and cultural purposes. The salt economy that once drew settlers to places like Bonneville has transformed into something entirely different. Where pioneers harvested salt for preservation and trade, modern industries extract lithium and other minerals for batteries and technology. But this transition from old extractive economy to new reflects larger patterns across the American West, where landscapes serve constantly shifting purposes. The flats themselves have witnessed this evolution, from Native American trails to pioneer wagon routes to the high-speed proving grounds they became. Each era leaves its mark, though the visual simplicity of the environment disguises this layered history. Southeast of Utah, the landscape transforms again into the dramatic depths of the Grand Canyon, though lesser-known formations throughout the Four Corners region offer their own geological revelations. Canyon de Chelly in Arizona presents sandstone walls that rise hundreds of feet above meandering washes, their surfaces decorated with ancient pictographs and the ruins of ancestral Puebloan dwellings. Unlike the Grand Canyon's overwhelming scale, Canyon de Chelly maintains an intimate quality despite its grandeur. The canyon floor remains a living landscape where Navajo families still farm, maintaining connections to the land that stretch back generations. Spider Rock, a sandstone spire rising over 800 feet from the canyon floor, features prominently in Navajo cosmology as the home of Spider Woman, who taught the Dini people the art of weaving. The red sandstone walls here tell stories through both geological strata and human presence. White House ruins, built into an alcove partway up the canyon wall, showcase the architectural sophistication of people who thrived in this environment centuries ago. They constructed multi-story dwellings that took advantage of natural shelter while providing defensive positions and temperature regulation. The alcoves themselves form through differential erosion, where softer rock layers weathered away beneath harder capstone layers. This same process created dwelling sites throughout the Southwest, from Mesa Verde to Bandelier. Navajo families who live in Canyon de Chelly today navigate a complex relationship between tradition and modernity, between private land use and national monument designation. The canyon bottom remains largely closed to visitors without Navajo guides, an arrangement that preserves both the sanctity of occupied land and the economic opportunity for local guides to share their knowledge and stories. Peach orchards planted generations ago still produce fruit along the canyon floor. Sheep and cattle graze on vegetation nourished by seasonal water flows. The relationship between land and people here demonstrates continuity rather than the rupture that characterizes so many American landscapes. Moving eastward into New Mexico, the landscape shifts from red rock canyons to the unique geology of the Carlsbad Caverns. Beneath the Guadalupe Mountains lies one of the world's most extensive cave systems, carved not primarily by the action of surface water, but by sulfuric acid dissolution. This unusual formation process resulted from hydrogen sulfide gas rising from oil deposits below, mixing with oxygen in groundwater to create acid that dissolved the limestone. The result is a vast underground chamber called the Big Room, which spans over 8 acres and could contain 6 football fields. The scale disorients visitors accustomed to surface landscapes, where sight lines and spatial relationships follow more familiar patterns. The caverns demonstrate that the dramatic landscapes of America exist not just on the surface, but extend into hidden dimensions beneath our feet. Stalactites and stalagmites grow at rates measured in centuries, creating formations that resemble frozen waterfalls, delicate draperies, and abstract sculptures. The Rock of Ages, a massive column that formed where a stalactite and stalagmite joined, has been growing for millennia. In the deeper reaches of the cave system, pools of water maintain constant temperatures and host unique ecosystems adapted to perpetual darkness. Extremophile bacteria thrive in conditions that would be inhospitable to most life, surviving on minerals and chemicals rather than photosynthesis. Every evening during warmer months, Brazilian free-tailed bats emerge from the cavern entrance in massive spiraling clouds that can contain over 300,000 individuals. They navigate by echolocation, emitting high-frequency calls and interpreting the returning echoes to build sonic maps of their environment. These bats migrate from Mexico each spring to give birth in the caverns, where stable temperatures and protection from predators create ideal nursery conditions. Their nightly departure to feed on insects and their dawn return create a natural spectacle that predates human presence in the region by millions of years. The guano they deposit on the cave floor accumulated over millennia into deposits that were mined in the early 20th century for fertilizer, representing yet another way humans have extracted resources from these landscapes. The connection between surface and subsurface extends throughout the Southwest in various forms. In Texas, the Edwards Aquifer provides water to millions of people in San Antonio and surrounding areas, its recharge zones fed by rainfall that percolates through limestone. The aquifer supports unique species found nowhere else, including the blind salamander and other troglodytic organisms that have lost their eyes through evolutionary adaptation to permanent darkness. Protection of recharge zones from development and pollution represents an ongoing challenge, so particularly as populations grow and climate patterns shift. What happens on the surface directly impacts these underground systems, though the connections remain invisible to casual observation. Near the Texas-Louisiana border, the landscape transitions into wetlands that represent entirely different ecological processes. The Big Thicket of East Texas contains an unusual convergence of ecosystems, where southeastern swamps meet western deserts, southern coastal plains meet central forests. This biological crossroads supports exceptional biodiversity in a relatively compact area, earning it designation as America's first national preserve under legislation designed to protect landscapes that didn't fit traditional national park criteria. Orchids bloom in the understory, while carnivorous pitcher plants trap insects in their specialized leaves, adaptations to nutrient-poor soils that force these plants to obtain nitrogen and phosphorus from prey rather than soil. The density and diversity of the Big Thicket stand in stark contrast to the openness of western landscapes. Walking through its palmetto-filled bottomlands feels claustrophobic after the expansive vistas of Utah or Nevada. Spanish moss drapes from oak and cypress branches, creating veils of gray-green that filter sunlight into dim, greenish illumination. Water moves slowly through the thicket, staining brown with tannins from decaying vegetation, creating black water streams that support populations of alligators, river otters, and various species of fish. And the soundscape here differs dramatically from desert or mountain environments, filled with the calls of countless insects, birds, and tree frogs that create a constant chorus, particularly during evening hours. Hurricane disturbances periodically reshape the Big Thicket, toppling trees and altering hydrology. Unlike western landscapes shaped by fire, drought, and erosion, this environment responds to wind, flood, and rapid vegetation growth. A gap created by a fallen tree becomes a race between competing species to claim the newly available sunlight. Vines grow at remarkable rates during the long growing season. The subtropical climate allows for nearly year-round biological activity, though winter does bring dormancy to some species, while evergreen hollies and other plants maintain their foliage. Moving toward the Gulf Coast, the landscape opens into vast wetland systems that once covered much larger areas before drainage for agriculture and development. The Atchafalaya Basin in Louisiana represents America's largest river swamp, a complex maze of bayous, lakes, and distributary channels, where the Atchafalaya River carries approximately 30% of the Mississippi's water toward the Gulf of Mexico. This massive flow exists because the Mississippi attempted to shift its main channel, a process that would have abandoned New Orleans and Baton Rouge as river ports. The Army Corps of Engineers intervened with control structures that maintain the current flow distribution, essentially forcing the river to remain in its historical course despite the river's natural tendency toward the shorter, steeper route through the Atchafalaya. The basin itself supports unique cultural traditions adapted to its watery environment. Cajun communities developed ways of life based on fishing, trapping, and harvesting crawfish from the swamp's productive waters. Houses built on stilts or floating on barges accommodate seasonal flooding. Moss harvesting once provided income when Spanish moss was collected, cleaned, and used as stuffing for furniture and mattresses. The advent of synthetic materials ended that industry, but the cultural knowledge of navigating swamp waterways, identifying fish and game, and reading water conditions persists among families who have lived here for generations. Cypress trees dominate the swamp forest, their characteristic knees projecting above water levels. These pneumatophores allow root systems to obtain oxygen even when inundated, an adaptation that lets cypress thrive in conditions that would drown most tree species. The largest cypress trees in the basin are relatively young compared to old-growth forests elsewhere because logging removed most of the ancient trees during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Some of those harvested trees were over 1,000 years old and measured 15 feet or more in diameter. The timber they yielded was highly valued for its rot resistance and workability, leading to intensive extraction that left few old specimens standing. Current cypress trees represent regrowth, a forest still recovering from industrial harvest decades ago. Alligators move through these waters as top predators, their presence shaping the behavior of other species. During drought years, alligators excavate wallows that become refugia for fish and other aquatic organisms, essentially maintaining habitat that benefits numerous species beyond the alligators themselves. These reptiles can live for decades, growing slowly but continuously throughout their lives. Large males establish territories that they defend during breeding season, their bellowing calls carrying across the swamp. The restoration of alligator populations from their depleted state in the mid-20th century represents a conservation success, though it required legal protection and enforcement against poaching. The productivity of Gulf Coast wetlands extends beyond freshwater systems into the estuaries where rivers meet the sea. These brackish transition zones support juvenile fish, shrimp, and crabs that depend on the shelter and food sources found among marsh grasses and in shallow, protected waters. The economics of Gulf seafood industries rely entirely on the health of these estuarine nurseries. When coastal wetlands are lost to erosion, subsidence, or development, fishery productivity declines. Louisiana loses a football field's worth of coastal wetland approximately every hour, a staggering rate driven by multiple factors including sediment starvation from upstream dams and levees, canal dredging for oil and gas access, and sea level rise that overwhelms the natural processes of delta building. The Mississippi River Delta represents one of the most dramatic examples of human attempts to control natural processes. Levees that protect communities from flooding also prevent the river from depositing sediment across the delta during floods, the very process that built the delta over millennia. Instead, sediment flows through controlled channels directly into deep Gulf waters, where it settles beyond the continental shelf, essentially lost to delta building. Engineering solutions have been proposed to restore some sediment distribution through controlled diversions, but implementing these changes involves complicated trade-offs between flood protection, navigation, economic interests, and ecosystem restoration. Moving along the Gulf Coast toward Florida, the landscape transitions through various iterations of wetland, forest, and coastal plain. The Everglades represent yet another unique ecosystem. A vast sheet flow of water moving almost imperceptibly southward from Lake Okeechobee toward Florida Bay. This river of grass, as it's often called, originally covered over 4,000 square miles before drainage projects reduced its extent by more than half. The Everglades are neither swamp nor marsh in the conventional sense, but a slow-moving river barely deep enough to cover the sawgrass that dominates much of its landscape. Walking through the Everglades means wading through water that may be ankle to knee deep, surrounded by sawgrass that can grow 8 feet tall and has serrated edges that justify its name. Tree islands called hammocks rise slightly above the surrounding wetland, providing elevated ground where hardwood trees establish themselves. These hammocks often form around limestone outcrops that create subtle high points in an otherwise flat landscape. Soil accumulates around the trees, building organic matter that further raises the elevation. Each hammock develops its own microclimate and species composition, creating biodiversity hotspots within the larger wetland system. Orchids and air plants festoon the branches of hammock trees, taking advantage of the elevated perches and avoiding the periodic flooding that covers the ground. The Everglades support species found nowhere else, including the Florida panther, which has been reduced to a small population concentrated in southwestern Florida. These panthers face challenges from habitat fragmentation, vehicle collisions, and genetic issues related to their small population size. Conservation efforts have included introducing Texas cougars to increase genetic diversity, construction of wildlife underpasses beneath major highways, and habitat protection. The panthers serve as an umbrella species, meaning that protecting enough landscape for viable panther populations also protects habitat for numerous other species that share the ecosystem. American crocodiles, distinct from the more common alligators, inhabit the brackish waters of southern Florida, particularly around Florida Bay, and the mangrove zones where freshwater and saltwater mix. These crocodiles represent the northern limit of a species more commonly associated with Caribbean and Central American waters. They tend to be more reclusive than alligators and have narrower snouts adapted to their diet of fish. The coexistence of both crocodiles and alligators in southern Florida is unusual, a product of the region's position as a transitional zone between temperate and tropical conditions. Mangrove forests fringe the southern tip of Florida, creating dense thickets where aerial roots create impenetrable tangles both above and below the waterline. 3 species of mangrove predominate, each occupying slightly different positions relative to tide levels and salinity gradients. Red mangroves extend farthest into the water, their prop roots creating arches that trap sediment and gradually build land seaward. Black mangroves grow slightly upslope, their pneumatophores projecting upward from the mud like thousands of stubby pencils. White mangroves occupy the highest positions, less frequently inundated by tides. Altogether, these species create productive ecosystems that filter water, stabilize shorelines, and provide nursery habitat for marine species. The Florida Keys represent a different landscape entirely, a chain of limestone and coral islands extending southwest from the mainland. These islands form through different processes at different times, with the Upper Keys composed of ancient coral reef that grew during the last interglacial period when sea levels were higher than today. The Lower Keys consist largely of Miami limestone, a rock formed from fragments of shells and marine organisms. The 7-mile bridge connecting the Middle and Lower Keys provides dramatic views of open water stretching to the horizon, a reminder that these islands are small outposts separated by expanses of shallow sea. The coral reefs offshore from the Keys once thrived as the only barrier reef system in North American waters, comparable to Caribbean reefs in diversity and structure. These reefs faced numerous challenges over recent decades, from coral bleaching events triggered by elevated water temperatures to disease outbreaks to physical damage from hurricanes and ship groundings. Staghorn and elkhorn corals, once dominant species that created complex 3-dimensional structure throughout shallow reef zones, declined drastically and received protection under the Endangered Species Act. The loss of living coral doesn't just affect the corals themselves, but ripples through entire ecosystems of fish, invertebrates, and algae that depend on reef structure for habitat, food, and shelter. Coral reefs represent among the most biodiverse ecosystems on Earth, rivaling rainforests in the number of species they support. A single reef can host thousands of species, from tiny cleaning shrimp that remove parasites from fish to massive groupers that can weigh hundreds of pounds. Parrotfish graze on algae, their powerful beaks scraping the reef surface and grinding ingested coral rock into sand that accumulates in white beaches. Angelfish, butterfly fish, and countless other species create a kaleidoscope of colors moving through reef corridors. At night, the reef transforms as diurnal species shelter in crevices and nocturnal species emerge to hunt, demonstrating that these ecosystems operate continuously through day-night cycles with different species active during each period. And the relationship between coral reefs and human communities in the Keys has evolved considerably over time. Early settlers survived through wrecking, salvaging goods from ships that ran aground on the reefs. Key West became a prosperous town based partly on this salvage economy. Later, sponge harvesting provided income until disease wiped out commercial sponge populations in the 1940s. Tourism gradually became the dominant economy, predicated largely on the natural beauty of the reefs and warm, clear waters. This created a situation where economic interests aligned with conservation, though tensions remained between access and protection, between allowing visitors to experience reefs and preventing damage from overuse. Climate change poses existential threats to coral reefs globally, and the Keys reefs are no exception. Ocean warming triggers coral bleaching, where corals expel the symbiotic algae that provide most of their nutrition. If temperatures remain elevated too long, bleached corals starve and die. Ocean acidification, caused by increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide dissolving in seawater, reduces the availability of calcium carbonate that corals need to build their skeletons. These broad-scale stressors interact with local factors like water quality, overfishing, and physical disturbance to determine whether reefs can persist. Some researchers work on identifying coral genotypes that show greater heat tolerance, essentially seeking to help reefs adapt to changing conditions by propagating the most resilient individuals. The contrast between the vibrant life of healthy coral reefs and the stark geological formations of places like the Badlands or Utah's salt flats illustrates the extraordinary range of American landscapes. Where the Badlands show erosion stripping away rock in an arid environment, and the salt flats represent an extreme of aridity and chemical concentration, coral reefs demonstrate the productive potential of warm, shallow marine environments. Each landscape operates under different physical and chemical constraints, supporting communities of organisms adapted to their specific conditions. Understanding these places requires recognizing both the universal processes that shape Earth's surface and the particular conditions that make each location unique. The Keys extend westward to the dry Tortugas, a cluster of small islands located about 70 miles west of Key West. These remote islands, accessible only by boat or seaplane, remain largely undeveloped except for Fort Jefferson, a massive but never completed fortress built in the mid-19th century. The fort occupies almost all of Garden Key, its brick walls rising from the sand as an artifact of military architecture from an era when coastal forts seemed necessary for defense. The fort never saw combat, but served as a prison, most famously for Dr. Samuel Mudd, who was convicted of conspiracy in Abraham Lincoln's assassination for setting John Wilkes Booth's broken leg. The name Dry Tortugas derives from the abundant sea turtles found here, tortugas in Spanish, and the lack of fresh water on these islands. Early mariners stopped to harvest turtles for food, depleting populations that have only partially recovered under current protections. The islands themselves consist of coral sand and rubble, barely rising above sea level. Storm surges can wash entirely over them, redistributing sand and limiting vegetation to salt-tolerant species that can survive both marine exposure and intense sun. The surrounding waters remain remarkably clear, with visibility often exceeding 100 feet, allowing snorkelers and divers to observe reef life, shipwrecks, and the interplay between land and sea that defines these isolated specks in the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf waters around the Keys harbor more than coral ecosystems. Centuries of maritime traffic have left a graveyard of shipwrecks scattered across the seafloor, each one telling stories of commerce, war, and miscalculation. Spanish galleons carrying treasure from the New World encountered hurricanes and hidden reefs along this treacherous route. Salvagers and treasure hunters have recovered fortunes in gold and silver coins from these wrecks, yet many vessels remain undiscovered, their cargoes resting beneath sand and coral overgrowth. Modern recreational divers explore accessible wrecks, swimming through the skeletal remains of steel freighters and wooden schooners, where fish now make their homes among rusted machinery and collapsed decks. The human story of the Florida Keys weaves through maritime adventure, isolation, and adaptation. Early inhabitants survived on fishing and turtle harvesting, developing skills to navigate the maze of islands and channels. The arrival of the railroad in the early 20th century connected the Keys to the mainland through an engineering marvel that required building bridges across open water and filling gaps between islands. Hurricane destruction later forced reconstruction as a highway, yet the achievement of spanning such distances across ocean remains impressive. Small communities developed their own characters, from fishing villages to artist colonies, each shaped by distance from the mainland and proximity to the sea. Key West, the southernmost point in the continental United States, carries particular historical weight. Its strategic location made it valuable for military purposes, serving as a naval station and fortress. The city grew wealthy from salvaging wrecked ships, developing a sophisticated salvage industry with legal frameworks for claiming cargo from vessels that foundered on nearby reefs. Writers and artists found inspiration in the tropical setting and relaxed atmosphere. Ernest Hemingway lived and worked there, producing some of his most celebrated novels while enjoying the fishing and drinking culture. Today, visitors tour his former home, now populated by descendants of his six-toed cats, wandering the grounds as living connections to literary history. Environmental pressures on the Keys come from multiple directions. Climate change brings rising seas that threaten to inundate low-lying islands, forcing communities to consider long-term survival strategies. Ocean acidification weakens coral structures, making reefs more vulnerable to storm damage and disease. Development pressure increases as more people seek to build and live in this tropical setting, despite hurricane risks and limited freshwater resources. Balancing tourism revenue with ecosystem protection creates constant tension, as boat anchors damage seagrass beds and increased human presence disturbs wildlife. Conservation efforts focus on establishing marine protected areas, restoring damaged reefs through coral nurseries, and educating visitors about responsible interaction with fragile environments. Moving from tropical waters to desert extremes, Death Valley in California and Nevada represents perhaps the most hostile environment in North America. Summer temperatures regularly exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit, making it one of the hottest places on Earth. And the valley floor sits 282 feet below sea level, creating a basin where heat accumulates and rainfall evaporates before providing much benefit to life. Yet even here, adaptation and survival persist. Plants like the creosote bush and desert holly have evolved to conserve water and withstand temperature extremes. Animals emerge primarily at night, avoiding the lethal midday heat. Human visitors time their trips for cooler months, exploring a landscape that seems more lunar than terrestrial. The geology of Death Valley reveals processes of mountain building and erosion stretched across millions of years. Fault lines running through the region have pulled the valley floor downward while pushing surrounding mountains upward, creating dramatic elevation changes over short distances. Alluvial fans spread from canyon mouths where flash floods deposit sediment in broad deltas. Salt flats expand across the valley floor, formed from ancient lakes that evaporated, leaving behind thick mineral deposits. Badwater Basin, the lowest point in North America, showcases hexagonal salt formations created by crystallization and surface tension. Standing there, visitors can look up at a sign on the cliff wall marking sea level, hundreds of feet above their heads, emphasizing the depth of this geological depression. Color adds unexpected beauty to Death Valley's harsh terrain. Artist's palette displays hillsides painted in shades of green, purple, pink, and gold, created by oxidized metals in volcanic deposits. Golden Canyon glows in late afternoon light, its eroded walls channeling visitors through narrow passages between towering cliffs. Zabriskie Point offers panoramic views across Badlands formations, their ridges and valleys creating waves of stone frozen in time. Photographers chase the changing light, capturing moments when low sun transforms harsh landscapes into studies in shadow and illumination. Life finds surprising niches even in this extreme environment. Pupfish species evolved in isolated springs and pools, becoming genetically distinct populations as water sources separated over thousands of years. Some species exist in only a single spring, making them among the rarest fish on Earth. Desert bighorn sheep navigate rocky slopes with remarkable agility, finding water in hidden seeps and springs. Coyotes, ravens, and sidewinder rattlesnakes hunt and scavenge, demonstrating that adaptation can overcome seemingly impossible conditions. Spring rains occasionally trigger wildflower blooms that carpet valley floors in yellow and purple, brief explosions of color and life before summer heat returns. Human history in Death Valley includes both tragedy and perseverance. The area's name comes from 49ers who attempted a shortcut to California goldfields and nearly died crossing the harsh terrain. Mining operations later extracted borax, gold, and other minerals, leaving behind ruins of mills and camps. The famous 20 mule teams hauled borax wagons across the desert, becoming symbols of American frontier determination. Today, these historical sites dot the landscape, reminders of boom and bust cycles and the harsh realities faced by those seeking fortune in unforgiving country. Climate extremes in Death Valley push equipment and infrastructure to their limits. Roads can buckle from heat. Vehicles require special preparation and constant monitoring of coolant levels. Visitors must carry excess water and plan routes carefully, as breakdown in remote areas can quickly become life-threatening. The National Park Service posts warnings about hiking during summer months, when even short walks expose people to dangerous heat. Yet the landscape draws researchers studying extremophiles and climate adaptation, using Death Valley as an analog for understanding life on other planets and predicting how organisms might respond to global temperature increases. Shifting northward, the Cascade Range stretches from Northern California through Oregon and Washington into British Columbia, forming a volcanic arc that includes some of the most dramatic peaks in North America. Mount Rainier dominates the Seattle skyline. its glaciated summit rising over 14,000 feet. Mount Hood, Mount Shasta, and Lassen Peak each carry geological histories of eruption and dormancy. These volcanoes form part of the Pacific Ring of Fire, where tectonic plates collide and create conditions for magma to rise toward the surface. Geologists monitor seismic activity closely, knowing that these sleeping giants could awaken with little warning. The eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980 reminded modern America that volcanic hazards remain real and present. The lateral blast flattened forests across hundreds of square miles, sent ash clouds into the stratosphere, and killed 57 people. The catastrophic landslide that triggered the eruption created the largest debris avalanche in recorded history, yet the aftermath also provided unprecedented opportunities to study ecological recovery. Scientists documented how life returned to the devastated landscape, from bacteria and fungi colonizing sterile ash to elk and bears eventually reclaiming territory. Decades later, the monument preserves both the destruction and the healing, showing visitors the power of geological forces and the resilience of natural systems. Alpine ecosystems in the Cascades support specialized communities adapted to short-growing seasons and heavy snow. Subalpine fir and mountain hemlock form Krummholz zones at tree line, their twisted forms sculpted by wind and ice. Wildflower meadows explode with color during brief summers, as lupines, a paintbrush and avalanche lilies race to bloom, set seed, and prepare for winter's return. Picas gather grasses into hay piles, curing them like tiny farmers preparing winter fodder. Mountain goats navigate impossible cliffs with split hooves that provide traction on narrow ledges. The same landscapes that attract summer hikers become winter playgrounds for backcountry skiers, though avalanche danger requires constant respect and knowledge. Water defines much of the Cascade ecosystem. Glaciers still cling to higher peaks, slowly grinding rock into flour and feeding rivers that flow year-round. Snowpack accumulation determines summer water availability throughout the region, affecting agriculture, cities, and salmon runs. Old-growth forests act as sponges, moderating water flow and preventing floods. Moss-draped trees in temperate rainforests absorb moisture from fog, creating ecosystems where rainfall measurements understate actual water availability. Waterfalls cascade down steep valleys, from powerful torrents like Multnomah Falls to delicate wisps that blow sideways in wind before reaching the ground. The Columbia River Gorge cuts through the Cascade Range, creating a unique corridor where desert and rainforest ecosystems meet within miles of each other. The gorge serves as a wind tunnel, with air pressure differences between coastal and interior regions funneling powerful winds through the gap. Windsurfers and kiteboarders flock to the area, taking advantage of consistent, strong winds. The river itself once thundered over massive waterfalls before dam construction submerged them, and fundamentally altering the landscape and fish migration patterns. Indigenous peoples harvested salmon at these falls for thousands of years, developing complex fishing platforms and preservation techniques that sustained large populations. Native American cultures throughout the Cascade region built their lives around salmon runs. The fish represented not just food, but spiritual and cultural identity. Entire calendars revolved around salmon returns, with ceremonies marking first catches and giving thanks for abundance. Traditional ecological knowledge guided harvest practices that sustained runs for generations. Dam construction devastated these relationships, blocking migration routes and flooding sacred sites. Modern treaty rights and restoration efforts attempt to rebuild salmon populations and honor tribal fishing rights, though challenges from habitat loss, hatchery practices, and ocean conditions complicate recovery. Fire plays an essential role in Cascade ecosystems, though management approaches have evolved dramatically. Historical fire suppression policies allowed fuel accumulation that now creates conditions for catastrophic burns. Indigenous peoples traditionally used fire as a management tool, maintaining meadows and promoting useful plant species. Current understanding recognizes fire as necessary for forest health, triggering seed release in certain conifers, and creating the mosaic of forest ages that supports biodiversity. Prescribed burns and managed natural fires now supplement suppression efforts, though smoke impacts on air quality and property protection concerns complicate implementation. Moving eastward into the Great Basin, vast expanses of sagebrush steppes stretch across Nevada, Utah, and parts of surrounding states. This region receives little rainfall, trapped in the rain shadow of the Sierra Nevada and Cascade Ranges. Ancient Lake La Hontan and Lake Bonneville once covered much of this area during wetter climate periods, leaving behind salt flats, tufa formations, and terraced shorelines visible on mountains that once formed islands. The Great Salt Lake represents a remnant of Lake Bonneville, its high salinity supporting only brine shrimp and alkali flies, but providing critical habitat for millions of migrating birds. Sagebrush ecosystems appear monotonous at first glance, but closer examination reveals rich diversity. Different sagebrush species occupy specific soil and elevation zones. Bitterbrush, rabbitbrush, and various bunch grasses create structure and resources for wildlife. Greater sage grouse depend on sagebrush for food and shelter, performing elaborate mating displays on traditional leks each spring. Their declining populations reflect broader ecosystem degradation from fire, invasive species like cheatgrass, and habitat fragmentation. Conservation efforts focus on protecting remaining sagebrush habitat and restoring areas where fire has converted perennial ecosystems to annual grasslands. Black Rock Desert in northwestern Nevada demonstrates extreme conditions within the Great Basin. This ancient lakebed provides a vast flat surface that becomes the temporary home of Burning Man, an annual gathering that creates a city of tens of thousands in the desert for 1 week. The playa surface, when dry, supports high-speed travel, attracting land speed record attempts. When wet, the clay becomes impassable, trapping vehicles in sticky mud. Dust storms can reduce visibility to 0 within seconds. Temperature swings of 50 degrees between day and night challenge human comfort and equipment function. Yet people continue to find meaning in the extreme environment, using the blank canvas of the desert for art, community, and exploration of alternative social structures. Geothermal features scatter across the Great Basin, evidence of the thin crust and volcanic activity that characterize the region. Hot springs provide oases of warmth in cold desert nights. Some have been developed into resorts, while others remain wild and undeveloped. Geothermal power plants tap underground heat to generate electricity, using a renewable resource that produces minimal emissions compared to fossil fuels. These features remind visitors that the earth beneath them remains active and dynamic, with heat and pressure building in ways that might eventually reshape the landscape. Moving north into Idaho, Craters of the Moon. National Monument preserves a volcanic landscape so unusual that astronauts trained there before moon missions. Basalt flows created twisted formations, lava tubes, and cinder cones across 75,000 acres. The black rock absorbs heat, making summer temperatures brutal, while winter brings snow that creates stark contrast against dark stone. Vegetation struggles to establish itself, finding purchase in cracks where soil accumulates. Dwarf buckwheat and other hardy species create islands of life in stone seas. Mule deer navigate the rough terrain, their tracks sometimes the only sign of animal presence. The lava tubes at Craters of the Moon offer underground environments where temperature remains constant year-round. Ice persists in some tubes even during summer, formed when cold winter air sinks into tunnels and remains trapped. Cave explorers navigate through passages that sometimes open into large chambers, other times requiring crawling through tight restrictions. Bats use some tubes as winter hibernation sites, hanging in clusters from ceilings. These subterranean spaces provide laboratories for studying how organisms adapt to dark, stable environments with minimal external input. Yellowstone National Park, straddling Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho, represents perhaps the most famous geological wonder in the United States. The park sits atop a supervolcano, a massive magma chamber that has erupted catastrophically several times in geological history. Current volcanic activity manifests as geysers, hot springs, mudpots, and fumaroles distributed across the landscape. Old Faithful remains the most famous geyser, erupting with remarkable regularity, though it's just one of several hundred geysers in the park. The colorful bacterial mats around hot springs create rainbow terraces, with different thermophile species thriving at specific temperatures and creating distinct color bands. Wildlife abundance in Yellowstone draws millions of visitors annually. Bison herds roam valleys, sometimes creating traffic jams as they cross roads or decide to rest on warm pavement. Wolf. Reintroduction in the mid-1990s restored predator-prey dynamics that had been disrupted for decades. Grizzly bears and black bears feed on everything from roots and berries to elk calves and winter-killed carcasses. Elk gather in large herds, particularly during fall rut when bulls bugle challenges and fight for dominance. Trumpeter swans, sandhill cranes, and numerous other bird species use wetlands and rivers. The ecosystem functions with relative completeness, offering glimpses of how landscapes operated before widespread human alteration. The Grand Teton Range, just south of Yellowstone, rises abruptly from valley floors without foothills to soften the transition. Glaciers carved the peaks into sharp spires and horns, creating some of the most photographed mountains in North America. Jenny Lake reflects the peaks in its calm waters, doubling the visual drama. Climbers test themselves on technical routes up granite walls, following paths established by mountaineering pioneers. Hikers circle lakes and climb to alpine meadows, where views extend for miles. The combination of easy access and genuine wilderness creates opportunities for both casual visitors and serious backcountry travelers. Moving westward, the Sierra Nevada range forms a massive granite barrier running north-south through California. These mountains capture Pacific moisture, creating heavy snowfall on western slopes while leaving eastern areas in rain shadow. The range includes Mount Whitney, the highest point in the lower 48 states, and Yosemite Valley, carved by glaciers into one of the most iconic landscapes on Earth. Granite domes and cliffs rise thousands of feet above valley floors. Waterfalls plunge from hanging valleys, with Yosemite Falls dropping nearly half a mile in 3 separate cascades. El Capitan challenges rock climbers with its sheer face, while Half Dome's distinctive profile defines the park's skyline. Giant sequoias grow in scattered groves along the Sierra Nevada's western slope, existing nowhere else naturally on Earth. These trees reach heights over 300 feet and can live more than 3,000 years. Their massive trunks, sometimes exceeding 30 feet in diameter at the base, contain more wood volume than any other tree species. Thick bark protects them from fire, and they actually require fire for successful reproduction, as heat opens cones and clears understory vegetation. So standing among these giants creates visceral connections to deep time, as these trees were already ancient when European explorers first reached California. John Muir's advocacy for Sierra Nevada protection helped establish both Yosemite and Sequoia as national parks. His writings captured the spiritual and aesthetic values of wilderness, arguing that natural areas deserved preservation for their own sake beyond utilitarian resource extraction. His philosophy influenced conservation movements worldwide and helped shape American environmental values. Today, the John Muir Trail allows hikers to walk over 200 miles through the High Sierra, experiencing the landscapes that inspired his passion and prose. Water issues dominate Sierra Nevada management and politics. The range serves as California's water tower, with snowpack functioning as natural reservoir. Rivers draining west provide water for agriculture and cities through elaborate systems of dams and aqueducts. Los Angeles draws water from the eastern slope through tunnels and pipes, controversially draining Mono Lake and Owens Valley to supply distant urban needs. Climate change threatens snowpack accumulation, shifting precipitation from snow to rain and reducing late-season water availability. These challenges require rethinking water allocation, storage, and use across the state. The Mojave Desert, spreading across Southern California, Nevada, Arizona, and Utah, contains the distinctive Joshua tree, a species of yucca that defines the landscape. These strange trees, with their twisted branches and spiky leaves, create alien-looking forests particularly dense in Joshua Tree National Park. Rock formations weathered into fantastic shapes provide world-class rock climbing and bouldering. Desert tortoises dig burrows to escape temperature extremes, emerging to feed on spring grasses and wildflowers. Roadrunners dash after lizards and snakes, while kit foxes hunt rodents during cool nights. Death Valley occupies the lowest portion of the Mojave, but other areas demonstrate different desert characteristics. The Kelso Dunes rise 700 feet above surrounding terrain, their sand singing and booming when conditions allow avalanches on steep slip faces. Cinder cones dot the landscape, remnants of volcanic activity that continues to shape the region. Dry lakes temporarily fill after rare heavy rains, creating shallow wetlands that attract waterfowl and shorebirds before evaporation returns them to cracked clay surfaces. Moving south, the Sonoran Desert spans parts of California, Arizona, and Mexico, distinguished by its signature saguaro cactus. These giants can grow 50 feet tall and live 200 years, their ribbed trunks storing water to survive long droughts. Arms branch from main trunks, creating the classic western desert silhouette. Woodpeckers excavate nest cavities in saguaro trunks, and after they abandon them, elf owls, small falcons, and other species move in. White flowers bloom at branch tips in late spring, opening at night to allow pollination by bats and moths. Red fruits follow, providing food for birds and mammals while scattering seeds across the desert. Biodiversity in the Sonoran Desert exceeds other North American deserts, with mild winters allowing more species to survive. Ocotillo sends up tall stems topped with red flowers after rains. Palo Verde trees photosynthesize through green bark, conserving water by shedding leaves during dry periods. Cholla cacti appear fuzzy from a distance but reveal vicious barbed spines on closer approach. Desert ironwood trees can live over 1,000 years, their dense wood sinking in water and providing shade that creates favorable microclimates for other plants. Water remains the defining resource and limiting factor. Ancient cultures like the Hohokam built extensive canal systems to support agriculture in the Salt River Valley. Modern Phoenix and Tucson rely on Colorado River water and rapidly depleting groundwater. Golf courses and swimming pools seem particularly defiant in the desert context, though defenders argue that municipal water use constitutes a small fraction of total consumption, with agriculture dominating. Desert landscaping with native plants offers alternatives to thirsty lawns, reducing water demand while supporting local wildlife. These choices reflect broader questions about appropriate use of limited resources and long-term sustainability of growth in arid regions. The border between the United States and Mexico cuts through the Sonoran Desert, creating political and ecological complications. Wildlife corridors and migration routes ignore lines on maps. Bighorn sheep, jaguars, and ocelots traditionally moved across the region following resources and avoiding threats. Border wall construction fragments habitat, blocks animal movement, and disrupts natural drainage patterns. Conservation efforts attempt to work within political realities while protecting ecosystem function, though success remains uncertain. The collision of national security concerns and ecological needs creates conflict without easy resolution. Organ pipe cactus National Monument protects Sonoran Desert habitat along the border, preserving not just organ pipe cacti, but entire ecological communities. Night-blooming cereus opens huge white flowers after dark, filling the air with intense fragrance. Sanita cacti develop old man whiskers of gray spines at their tops. Javelinas, actually peccaries rather than true pigs, root for tubers and crunch prickly pear pads despite the spines. The park's isolation and harsh conditions keep visitation relatively low, preserving solitude increasingly rare in protected areas. Looking across this continental survey, from volcanic islands to coral reefs, from badlands to salt flats, from glaciated peaks to burning deserts, certain themes emerge. Geological forces continually reshape landscapes, working on timescales that dwarf human existence, yet occasionally manifesting in catastrophic events that demand immediate attention. Life adapts to seemingly impossible conditions, finding niches in the hottest deserts, coldest mountains, and most isolated islands. Human history interweaves with natural history as cultures develop in response to environmental conditions while simultaneously altering those environments through their activities. These diverse landscapes face accelerating challenges. Climate change shifts temperature and precipitation patterns faster than many species can adapt. Development fragments habitat and disrupts ecological processes. Invasive species outcompete native organisms and alter ecosystem function. Water scarcity intensifies as populations grow in arid regions. Rising seas threaten coastal communities and ecosystems. These problems don't have simple solutions, requiring instead sustained effort, compromise, and acknowledgement of difficult trade-offs. Yet reasons for hope persist. Protected areas preserve representative samples of ecosystems and species. Restoration projects rebuild degraded habitats. Scientific understanding of ecological processes improves management approaches. Growing awareness of environmental issues motivates conservation action. Traditional ecological knowledge gains recognition and integration with Western science. Young people increasingly demand environmental responsibility from institutions and leaders. The landscapes themselves demonstrate resilience. Ecosystems recover from disturbance when given opportunity. Species adapt when habitat remains available. Natural processes continue operating according to physical and biological laws, regardless of human desires. This resilience shouldn't breed complacency, as thresholds exist beyond which recovery becomes impossible or takes millennia. Rather, it should inspire appropriate humility and recognition that working with natural systems proves more effective than fighting against them. Visiting these places, whether volcanic beaches or coral reefs, badlands or salt flats, connects people viscerally with natural processes and deep time. Standing where lava meets ocean, walking across ancient seabeds uplifted into mountains, watching geysers erupt, or floating above coral gardens creates experiences that transcend description. These moments shift perspectives, revealing individual smallness within vast systems while simultaneously emphasizing the importance of choices made at personal and collective levels. The diversity of American landscapes reflects the continent's size, geological complexity, and climatic variation. No single ecosystem or region tells the complete story. Only by examining multiple landscapes, understanding their unique characteristics and shared patterns can the full picture emerge. Each place offers lessons and inspiration. Each merits protection and respect. Together, they compose a continental heritage worth maintaining for future generations who deserve opportunities to experience the same wonder, beauty, and connection that these extraordinary landscapes continue to provide.